So around, yes, a month ago, Ginny D made a video about ancestral weapons, and a month later, I've decided to make my own weapons video, because I think weapons are really slept on in Dungeons & Dragons. Maybe not in terms of use, definitely not in terms of use, we've all used weapons, I'm sure, at some points in our D&D campaigns, but in terms of story. The way we use weapons is just numbers on the stat sheet. Very often, weapons just amount to hit thing with sword, and that's it. There's nothing more to them. Sure, sometimes we might give them a name, sometimes they might do fire damage, but in terms of identity, in terms of something more to the weapon, there isn't really much. This doesn't just go for weapons, this goes for all items in D&D. Very often, items in D&D don't really carry sentimental value to the players, and if they do, it's usually just because they do more damage, and that's it. Sure, +1 rapier number 527 is cool, but I think that we can do more with weapons in D&D. Ginny D's video talked about this in a mechanical sense, using ancestral weapons to create evolving weapons for your players that will grow alongside them throughout the entire campaign, and obviously, I'm pretty sure players in that case will grow very attached to those weapons. They're going to be using them for a long time. But beyond mechanics, I want to talk about how we can make weapons that have true sentimental value to our players, and where we can take inspiration from, because very often when we think of iconic weapons, we look at movies and television shows, but when I think of iconic weapons, I turn my mind to video games. Video games have so many iconic weapons in so many different franchises. Weapons often become the symbol of their respective games because people love them that much. Video games take so much inspiration from D&D, and I figured we might as well turn that around. Let's take some inspiration from video games and look at weapons that will truly make your players fall in love with both your story and your game. Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, let's quickly table this discussion and talk about why we want to do this. What's the point of this, and why are we looking at video games of all things? Well, for starters, for the why. D&D is a game that needs engagement. Often, when we're running story-driven, role-play-heavy games, we need players to be engaged, and often, the best way to do that is to have them be attached to something in the campaign. It could be an NPC, it could be their own player characters, the dynamic of the party, etc. Players need to care about the story, they need to care about the campaign, otherwise it's just not going to work. So, weapons are not something that we often use in this sense. Sure, we'll put lots of details into our characters, their backstories, the world that we're playing in, but when it comes to weapons, so often they just become generic magic items that don't have further identity, that don't have a story, that the players just use because they are what they have in their inventory, and that's that. Why take inspiration from video game weapons like this one? Well, for starters, I got this prop and I'm going to use it a lot, damn it. It took a lot of time to paint. But other than that, video games are interactive. Like D&D, you are interacting with the game, and you're interacting with the story, and that allows players to get really invested in the gear that they're using to affect change inside the game that they're playing. Just like D&D. However, in D&D, we don't get sentimental attachments to our weapons nearly as much as player bases in video games do. I mean, take this thing. This thing is Thorn from Destiny, and people know what this is. When this appeared in the latest RPG horror story sets, a lot of people were able to instantly identify this weapon. Go to any Destiny player, ask them what this is, they'll know what it is, and they'll probably be able to tell you a story about it too. I think the gear and the loot that you collect can absolutely matter to the story of your campaign. So let's talk about how to make sentimental loot and build our stories to the next level, with tip number 1. Alright, let's be very honest here. I don't want to talk about mechanics too much, but if you do want players to become attached to a particular piece of gear, that piece of gear should probably be good at the very least, or at least interesting. It can't be bad, for certain. Sure, players can get attached to bad items. I've seen it happen. I mean, I can't be the only one who keeps the first wooden sword I craft in each Minecraft world, right? I'm not the only one who does that, right? But anyway, point is, sure, it's possible to get attached to bad gear, but it's definitely not something you're going to be using very often, and I think it's more likely that you're going to get attached to something because it's good, because it's potent, or at least because it's unique. Take Thorn here. Thorn was the bane of the Crucible in House of Wolves. I remember getting two-shot by this thing from like 100 meters away. This weapon was brutal. That's part of the reason so many people remember it. They remember the bad old days when Thorn ruled the PvP sandbox with a cursed fist. Now, of course, your weapons don't need to be that powerful, but they should be good at the very least. However, this does present a balancing problem. If you want your players to get attached to a weapon, they need to have it for a while. So how do we prevent level 3 players from getting super overpowered legendary gear and just destroying the campaign? Well, for starters, you can take the Ginny D approach, the ancestral weapons. She talked about this in her video that I brought up earlier, and it's a good solution. It's a $5 PDF if you want to pick it up, or you could just homebrew it yourself. Matt Mercer did a similar thing with his Vestiges of Divergence. Those weapons evolved over time, over the course of Campaign 1. Vox Machina unlocking aspects of their weaponry and having those weapons gain power over the course of the campaign, so that they weren't too powerful at the beginning. Evolving weapons are a good way to solve this problem, but I think the simpler solution is that you don't need to give them to your players at level 3. I mean, honestly, all of the tips I'm going to tell you, most of them can be achieved in like under 10 sessions. You just need to be able to deliver the story of the weapon, and you do need time to build that attachment. But I mean, let's be honest guys, 10 sessions is a long time. I mean, if you play weekly, that's 10 weeks of time where the player has this weapon in their inventory. I think that's plenty. Honestly, I don't see a problem with just waiting until the latter half of the campaign to give your players something powerful if you don't want to work with an evolving weapon system like ancestral weapons, or creating one like Matt Mercer did with the Vestiges. Both solutions work. I'm sure there are plenty of solutions to the power problem. You don't want to have power creep. You don't want to give your players something super overpowered to begin with. I did do that on accident, and that was totally my bad. And while it didn't ruin the campaign, it did present a lot of challenges that I could have easily avoided if I just thought about this more. But rest assured, power is a part of this, but isn't the only part. However, it can't be ignored, which is why I'm bringing it up now. Make sure that the weapon has some potency to it before you want your players to get super attached, because if it sucks, they're probably more likely to throw it into the bin. Alright, this is where it's going to get really fun. Identity and story. I think weapons that you want your players to get attached to need to have some sort of identity to them. They can't just be some generic axe. They need to have more to them. Now, they don't necessarily need to be this unique, but this is a good benchmark. Going back to Thorn, this is clearly not your everyday hand cannon. This is something different. It's clearly got some evil influences going on with its jagged edges. It looks fitting to the name. In the game, it bristles with hive magic, which is an enemy race, so clearly it's affiliated with some sort of evil power. And if you look at its lore and story, yeah, it is definitely affiliated with an evil power, to say the least. This is not a weapon wielded by the hands of good, and you can tell just by looking at it. You can see a story here. It looks interesting, it looks unique. If this was just some random hand cannon painted black and green, who really cares? I mean, sure, that would be cool, but it doesn't really scream, I am a cool weapon, use me to slaughter your foes. If you want your players to get attached to a piece of gear, it needs to stand out in their inventory. It can't just be one of the mass items that they've collected. This is especially true if you use our proposal from before, where we said you give the item to the player later on the campaign. By that point, I'm sure they've collected plenty of items, what makes this one cool among all the rest. Well, that is your job as the Dungeon Master to figure out. You are the one giving them the item after all. Like I kind of brought up earlier, art is a big part of this for me. I like playing D&D with a lot of visuals because I don't like just imagining things in my head. Theater of the mind doesn't really work for me. Now, of course, it could work in your game, and if it does, that's great. But if you don't use art, description is also a really powerful thing. Also, make sure that the identity of the weapon fits with what it does. This cannon in the game poisons enemies and steals their soul to empower itself. This fits the look of the weapon. This thing looks like a soul-stealing cannon with poison damage, doesn't it? It looks cool. It looks cool, but more importantly, it looks appropriate. That's something that you should also be thinking about. Make sure that when you describe your weapon, it also makes sense for what the weapon is. If it does fire damage, the sword should be, on fire. That's a simple example, but, I mean, it's a good principle to keep in mind. Now I know, cool is a generic word. I'm going to explain real quick. There's just so much to this point. I think that this point is really, really important. In my first campaign, like I said, I made plenty of mistakes, and this was my biggest one. I gave players items, but I didn't really associate the item with the quest needed to obtain it. They weren't thematically connected. one player had to slay a beholder and solve a bunch of riddles, but that didn't really connect to the sword that he acquired. The sword didn't have anything to do with the beholder or the riddles. It was just the sword was at the end of the dungeon in the beholder's treasure trove, and that's it. Sure, that makes sense. The beholder would collect legendary items. That doesn't make sense for its character, but it doesn't really thematically connect that much. It's not a heavy connection that makes the player feel like, oh my god, I earned this through an epic story that I just participated in. Instead, it was, oh, I happened to find this item at the end of this quest. I didn't really know about it being there, but hey, it's cool that it was there. That's not exactly the same thing. Those two principles are not on the same level. Now, you don't need to go all in on this and create a full thematic main quest line that takes like 20 sessions to acquire a weapon, but the acquisition process should fit what the players are acquiring. Destiny has pretty limited storytelling capabilities at times, especially in Destiny 1, but the acquisition process for this weapon did make sense. You had to use dark damage, void damage, to kill other players in the Crucible. You literally needed to kill your fellow guardians in order to acquire this thing, and at the very end you had to delve deep into the hive summoning pits, kill the wizard who corrupted this weapon's wielder, and then you finally collected the Cursed Thorn. Those steps made sense for this weapon, even if the actual story behind it wasn't really well communicated at the time. They did make sense. You felt like you were doing a bunch of evil deeds to acquire an evil weapon. If I used this principle in my own campaign, the sword that I made for my bard wouldn't be acquired after defeating some random beholder that the bard didn't really care about. The sword would be acquired after maybe besting a number of bard spirits in a trial by combat or a trial by performance, because the sword's whole thing is that a bunch of bards of the past blessed it with their power. That was the sword's whole gimmick, so why didn't I incorporate that into the story of acquiring the weapon in the first place? I mean, the reason I didn't do it was because I wasn't a very good DM at the time and I didn't think of it because I'm silly. But you do not need to be silly. You can learn from my mistakes. Another big thing is making sure that there's a degree of difficulty. I don't think acquiring weapons like this should be easy. I mean, one major reason that Thorn is remembered was that getting this thing in year 1 was not easy. This weapon has been re-released twice, meaning it's come out 3 times in total. And each time it re-released, I remember players going, "What I remember about acquiring Thorn was how quiet it was. During the waning hours of Dark Below, I got my exotic bounty after turning in 200 Crucible bounties and 300 Vanguard bounties. I was forced to delve into the Crucible, using an all-void loadout, every death resetting my progress. I had to kill hundreds of guardians in order to finally complete that thing, using Atheon's Epilogue, one of the worst weapons post-auto rifle nerf. But I did it. I remember going into the summoning pits and hiding in the back while the wizard spawned, and then beelining it for the wizard while hoping to God that Fogoth doesn't beam me down with his stupid laser eye. I remember taking the cursed hand cannon. I remember taking it into the Crucible, and I remember two-shotting people from 100 meters away like a little bitch. Good times, right? That whole process made the weapon memorable, and while I said earlier that the story and the themes of the weapon weren't properly communicated through the quest because of limited storytelling in Destiny at the time, the difficulty of it made people remember it. I mean, even years later, when this thing was re-released and Season of the Drifter in Destiny 2, people still remember the original Thorn quest. That sort of sentimentality for a quest should be carried into D&D. I mean, as a Dungeon Master, we can tailor quests to our players. And that brings us very neatly onto our next point. Don't just tailor the quest to the player, tailor the entire weapon, everything about it, to the player character. Make them related. This was the worst mistake I made when I did this same thing in my first campaign. When I was giving legendary weapons to my player characters, they didn't really relate to the player characters at all. Sure, the weapons were good, they were powerful, they were cool, they had all of the other tips, except for the appropriate quest one, but we'll ignore that. They had all the other tips, and it still didn't matter. Now, to be fair, the players didn't have long to use these weapons. They only used them for like 4 sessions, so yeah, that's another big failure on my part. But the worst thing was that the players didn't really have anything to do with these weapons. I gave my druid, who is really connected to the moon and the Moonweaver, a crown that lets her channel the power of lightning. those things aren't really connected, are they? And I didn't try to connect them in any way. I just said, oh, they're fighting a lightning-based bad guy, and she is a spellcaster, so being able to shoot lightning from her hands would be cool. But I didn't really think of, hey, she's a druid of the Moonweaver. Why not give her a weapon that has something to do with, I don't know, the moon? I could have just reflavored the lightning crown to give her power over moonbeams or something. I could have thought of something, but I didn't. And that was a big problem. Just swapping the crown's damage to radiant and saying that she shoots laser beams from the moon would have been something at the very least, but I didn't even think that far into it. That was a major failure on my part, but it doesn't need to be a major failure on your part. We're not video game developers. We don't need to make weapons that cater to millions of players. We just need to make weapons that cater to like 4 or 5, and that makes it way easier on us. Look, I've been talking about how much Thorn is remembered in the community, and this weapon is great, and people do know what this is, but it's not necessarily tailored to the Guardian, the player character inside of Destiny 2. This is a weapon meant for any character to acquire. It's not specific to my Guardian or my friend's Guardian or whatever. It's just meant for the entire player base. But again, we don't need to worry about that. We're making weapons for just a handful of player characters. I'm currently making legendary weapons, and I am trying to keep this principle in mind when I'm making these weapons for my players. I'm trying to keep in mind that they made their characters. They gave me characters to work with. I need to work with them. I need to give them gear and weapons that their characters would use. Weapons and gear that the players are going to care about. I'm learning from my own mistakes here, and I'm trying to make gear that means more to my players. I want them to really care about the weapons and gear that they have in their inventory. I don't want it to just be a bunch of stats on a stat sheet. I make these full item cards for a reason. I want them to see the weapons that they're using, to really think, wow, this thing looks neat. This thing looks really cool when they get an item. That's part of this whole thing for me. I think loot is a major part of D&D and something that a lot of DMs don't think too far beyond the mechanics of, and I think that that's a real missed opportunity. Look, if you don't do all of these tips, I totally understand. I'm not saying that this is mandatory, and I'm definitely not saying if you don't do this stuff, you're like a bad dungeon master, because that's absolutely not the case. However, if you want to take the story of your game to the next level, if you want to give another thing for your players to care about, I think creating more thematically relevant gear, gear with an identity, gear with a story, that could really spice up your D&D campaign and take your story to another level. I hope you guys enjoyed this really rambly video. I meant to make it a month ago when Ginny D released her video, but a lot of stuff happened and I never got to it. But here we are a month later. I finally did it, and now I can erase it off my whiteboard at long last. If you guys enjoyed, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out our RPG horror story series where we talk about the best of the worst of Dungeons and Dragons. And while you're there in the cards, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content right as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comments legendary to let me know you made it to the end of the video. And that's like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.